lovely to be here. It's lovely to be in South Africa. I love South Africa. It's wonderful to be in Cape Town among old friends and new friends. It's not so great to be on the last day because we've seen some pretty amazing work. So my name is T. I work at Google. One of the first questions I always get asked is, what is it exactly that you do? And then the second question that I get asked is, and why does Google let you do that? And neither of those have particularly satisfactory answers, I'm afraid. But I do stuff. This is the sort of work that I do. This is sort of an assortment from the last 10 years. And basically been an exploration. It has been a journey of exploration for me. And we're not going to talk. We'll talk about a couple of these projects, but we're really not going to talk much about my work because I'm not too interested. And besides which, I always find that why you've done something is much more interesting than what you've done. But we will talk a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about AI, maybe, and VR, and we might do some philosophy, maybe some quantum physics, Santa Claus, and possibly the circus. Who knows? But the main problem I have is that it's very embarrassing because I have to say that I'm a designer, but that's pretty much what I do. That's like the extent of my design skill. I draw things on whiteboards, and then no one understands what it is. So, and that's really what I do. I get very talented people, and I have to put them together. And it's extremely embarrassing, especially standing on this stage with all of these people who've been showing us this amazing work, to even pretend that I do anything. Because really all we're doing is taking talented people and putting them together with other talented people. I do talk a lot. I got a well-worn talk on YouTube about physical and digital and how we combine these things. I did a little book on doubt, which we were just talking about, and if you hadn't noticed, I'm transgender. And if you hadn't noticed, bless you. But it is probably time to close the laptop. Anyway, so we're talking to Ravi about what I was going to talk about, and I was talking about doubt, and I was very interested in doubt, and I wanted to talk about doubt, and Ravi was like, well, that's great, but is there anything else you want to talk about? And then he went and put the podcast of my doubt talk on Indaba website, so you can all go and listen to it in full, and that's fantastic. But it's also a very clever way of making you write a completely new talk. So the flip side of that is that I'm not completely sure what slide comes next. It's going to be one of those talks. That's right, Keats. So why on earth would we be looking at a picture of a 19-year-old from 200 years ago? And the reason we're looking at this picture is because he was 19 when he wrote this letter, and he used a phrase, coined a phrase which I find spectacularly relevant still today. It's this idea, it's about halfway down if you're bored. It says negative capability. And what he's talking about is humans' ability to speak, to write, to art, to create. What we do is transcendent. It is sublime. And that actually this human ability is pretty unique. And this is terribly relevant today because we are surrounded by all of these machines that are doing so much and are so incredible. And it is an extraordinary time. Our computer or our machine takes an input and derives an output. That's what it does. It needs an input to derive outputs. And even when you give it inputs which are highly variable, which are doubts. For example, I mean, I think this is like saying that art is like faith. Sort of artificial neural networks don't do faith. They don't do doubt. They derive. And even when they're deriving from variables they're deriving by quantifying and measuring and sampling and creating something that can be measured in order to provide or present things which are increasingly unbelievable and unbelievably beautiful, but still derivative. So this is a derivative creativity. And a little bit of what I want to talk about is whether what we do is a formal process or a transcendent process, whether what we create is more than the input. What is going on up here? The other reason I really love this is because he's got this lovely phrase about man is capable of being in uncertainties. And I often feel in uncertainties. I think women are capable of being in uncertainties as well. And that leads neatly on to weapons of mass destruction. Because we seemed pretty certain at the time, if I remember correctly. And then as that went on, there's this wonderful quote from Rumsfeld. I've got no time for Rumsfeld, but this is a Socratean jewel. This is polished up. This is basically philosophy. And it starts with poetry and moves through philosophy, and then it's still incredibly important to us today. And I don't know if any of you have ever spent enough time reading it, but it is a very important part of the creative process to have unknown unknowns. Things you do not know, you do not know. The idea that there are aspects of reality that we don't know, like what slide comes next. That's right. Socrates chased this up a little bit himself. So we go back 2,000 years, and we have Socrates, who's basically wandering around the world. Socrates wandering around asking. So people said he was the cleverest man ever, and he wanted to ask the world. So he went out through questioning. He questioned his doubts to discover whether there was certainties. He was searching for empiric evidence, and he really didn't find any. He discovered that actually what we had is doubt, and doubt is cool. That is the bit that is the best thing, like these questions that we can ask, poetic doubts, philosophical doubts, artistic doubts, that's the most interesting part of being alive, I think. And that's sort of what gets me up in the morning. I bring artists together with technology, with all this scary stuff, in an attempt to see if maybe we can bring artists and philosophers to answer the questions that at the moment are being answered by engineers and dot-com startups. Because I would much rather they were being answered by artists, or not actually answered. I would much rather these questions were being asked by artists, instead of which we are living in the past a little bit. We have a slightly more anachronistic approach to all of our culture. It lives in the past. This is a project called Editions at Play. It's a project we started last year, and it's really about one of those anachronisms, which is like, if a book is only a book because it's bound down the side, and it's only bound down the side because that was a terribly convenient thing to do about 400 years ago. Why, when we turn it into an e-book, do we still continue to use it as if it was bound down the side? So we did a whole project on that.
Editions at Play is an experiment into what books can become in a digital age. Some people say physical books have qualities that don't transfer well to digital. Editions at Play flips this idea on its head and asks, what if digital books had qualities that don't translate to print?
We created 4 books that cannot be printed and an online bookstore powered by Google Play. The books harness the dynamic properties of the web and are designed to be read on a mobile phone.
The first book is a novel set inside Street View by Rafe Larson. Entrances and exits weaves the writing together with the Street View interface, merging the aesthetics of digital and printed maps.
For the book Strata, we teamed up with Penguin Random House and Lex to create a collection of stories and related science essays. The stories complemented the rich world of illustration and music devised by comic book artist Tommy Lee Edwards and audiovisual collective I Speak Machine.
We explored how digital can challenge linear reading. In The Truth About Cats and Dogs, authors Joe Dunthorne and Sam Riviere invited readers to switch between their diaries and ultimately pick whose side they're on.
In Oldest Rotting by Alan Trotter, we looked at how the writing itself could be natively digital.
Instead of words written to be printed, the text reacts to gestural interactions and deteriorates over time to mirror the character's progressive memory loss.
Editions of Play was really well received across the design and technology media, the publishing industry and the general public, and a host of new partners are already lined up to join our experiment.
With more books in the pipeline, Editions of Play is only beginning to scratch the surface of what literature can become in a digital age.
We want to inspire the next generation of readers, writers and publishers to create it. So these are the books that we launched last year, and it was a fascinating project. And it did begin to answer, we actually started terribly conservatively. We began to understand, because you should really, because when you bring a writer who's used to working on their own, and then an editor who's used to being either telling a writer what to change, and then developers, and then designers, all of whom also have strong opinions about how things should work, it's quite complicated. And that's maybe one of the reasons why we are still writing in the way that, again, we have always written. Although increasingly we are doing collaborative writing, and increasingly there are generative texts. Anyway, this is a bit of a sneak preview, because these aren't launching until next month, hopefully. But we have 2 books coming out in a month's time. This is the first one, and I'm just going to play this film just because it's so beautiful. And it's by Joanna Walsh. And the second book, well, thank you. That's very sweet of you. I'll tell them you said so. The other book is a book of mine, and I'm very involved in it, and it's so complicated we had to make 3 films. Because we've got so many different parts of this running, and I'm going to play you, it's not quite finished really, the first one, to give you an idea about what we're talking about. This is a book, some music, our films. We used to own these things, and now we don't. Which is handy, right? Streaming is kind of convenient, so is buying a digital film or book online. But we don't own that film or book. We own a license to access it. Access is different to owning. If the company you bought the license from disappears, so does the book or film. We're interested in seeing if you can own something digital, so it simply belongs to you, to show that access and ownership are different, distinct things. So we have this idea to explore that by making a book that can be owned and accessed. It turns out there's a technology that's just right for this, blockchain. Anyone in the world can read the book. After all, it's just a website. But only 100 people will be able to own a copy and be seen to own it, thanks to a record of ownership that we write to the blockchain. On your phone, you read a specific book, one that belongs to someone, and each of those books has a record of ownership that is permanent and transparent, just like with a physical book, so that one owner can transfer ownership to another. We end up with a digital book that has its own family tree of owners. It has its own history. That book still belongs to someone, yet it can be read by anyone, anywhere who has access, just like a normal book. Culture Blocks. Experiments in owning digital culture. Okay, great. So apart from the VO, which is mortifying, but we don't have any budget, and the fact that it's not finished, we're working on this project which is to do with blockchains, to do with ownership and how that is ownership, that idea of ownership is very integral to owning objects, to owning things. But we lose it on the internet, but actually because we have a contract with the internet. And this is a very different thing. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that it's getting very weird people excited, because the copyright lawyers are quite interested. And it's really a very good meeting when the copyright lawyers are excited about your project. And we do this by creating perspectives on what it is that we are doing. What we're trying to do is and to create a perspective, you need dimensions. So we're going to talk a little bit about dimensionality, about the idea that you can move outside of the world. And this is your starting place. This is a book from 1880 by Edwin Abbott. It's actually a biting satire of Victorian social norms, but it didn't really get noticed at the time. But then, funnily enough, in the 1920s, when Einstein started talking about multidimensionality and this very complex idea of multiple dimensions to the nth dimension, suddenly this became a bit of a primer. Because if you've ever imagined yourself as a single point in space and time, which I'm sure we all have, no? Okay, just me. Okay, well, like a one dimension, that we exist maybe in one dimension. What would the world look like if we existed in one dimension? Or, as this book starts, in two dimensions, in flatlands. And then in the book, that's sort of the angel arrives and takes the narrator out into three dimensions so that they can suddenly look down and see on how extraordinarily kind of dumb it is trying to live in two dimensions. And then from there, you can actually move into fourth and fifth and sixth dimensions. And actually, it doesn't sound completely insane, even though this book was written in 1880. And I think that's important because I really feel like the relationship we have with information at the moment is really terribly linear. It's kind of like it's on here, and I walk around the world, and that's what I see. And I'm not sure that's very particularly right. Right? It's much more interesting if you start to consider information as a dimension, like time and space. If information is something which we can move around in. And another way to think about dimension is these are real binaries, white and black and white. That's a binary, right? Everyone understands what a binary is, a 1 and a 0. And we also understand that there's like this idea of a spectrum, and that you can go from black through to white. And we also understand that even within that, you can mimic the visual effect of 3 dimensions. But we also understand that actually, if you did have 3 dimensions, you could see that maybe there were tonal differences on the underside or either side. Basically, with each dimension, you get more information about the object that you are looking at. But fundamentally, or we very frequently keep it as black and white. And this talk definitely isn't about being transgender, although that is a very fascinating subject, even if I say so myself. But what it really is about is this extraordinary moment in your life when your reality changes, when you come out. I mean, I actually sort of knew when I was little, but when you come out, you have to do that again and your reality changes. And for those who know me well, you'll also know that I'm face blind. Which means I don't recognize faces. I thought that no one recognized faces, and I was just, but I don't know who I'm talking to an awful lot of the time. And that was a thing that I was like my mum saying, look, I think this is you. And my reality changed then as well. So frankly, I've had twice in my life where my complete sense of reality has shifted, and I'm really getting rather used to it. I find your confidence in your reality is really very, very misplaced. No, don't clap. I'm running out of time. It's terrible. So the main point is there isn't actually a spectrum on gender. There's just a lot of insanely cool people, like Kate, working it out as they go along. And that's why it makes it just like a teeny tiny bit annoying when it's basically, represented like that. I always like to draw them holding hands, but that's because I'm straight. Both kinds of straight. Easier, true or false? So you might not agree that there's a kind of, something's either true or it's false. There's sort of truthiness if you're an American, but they have a spectrum of truth. So in politics, certainly there is a spectrum when it comes to time. Things are false, and then they change and become true. And this is what happens with a lot of science. It's very important to remember that things become true. It's also true of relativity, like rugby. I mean, you used to be very good at rugby. No. And you still are very good at rugby. It's just that all the other teams have got better than you. Santa, no Santa. Surely this is a binary. This is not a binary. My 2-year-old believes in Santa. Santa is a real thing for him. His reality is that Santa exists. My 5-year-old thinks Santa may exist, but is too scared to ask. And I know that Santa doesn't exist because I have to pay for all the presents. Which brings us neatly into quantum physics. Cat, dead cat. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because of audience, you guys, and me, and something which is fundamentally shifting, which is our relationship with our audiences as designers, as creators, as makers, as artists, as playwrights, as anything. We are beginning to realize that this sphere of information is making it increasingly possible for us to have a kind of journey in and out of those experiences. And when it is linear, it feels linear. And when it is immersive, it feels immersive. And that's great, right? But not like this. That's a version of reality. And what I like to do, it's just a little bit of it. What I like to do is I would like to work with playwrights and artists and to try and see what happens when we take what would be there with the traditional forms if we were able to reinvent these forms, and to change sort of the context of these things. It's a bit like this event in many ways, and this is an example of it. This is a play with an audience of 2 and a cast of 6.
How could it be gone?
Never stand still.
Not where it's staying.
The central idea of the project that I think we all got really excited by was what if, as an audience member, you had the ability to be able to read the thoughts of the performers that you would be watching. And that became a really compelling conceit for us.
Relax your face. It's showing on your face. Your forehead is all screwed up. Relax your forehead. Relax your... Just breathe.
We put together a workshop to discuss ways in which we can produce a play that has digital at its core, but doesn't feel that it's led by a device or a screen.
We created a number of prototypes using the gyroscope and the accelerometer and trying to get that down to a really narrow focus while playing synced audio tracks simultaneously.
Mention it once he's sat down, once he's had his tea. Should get that on. Is there enough milk? Oh, darn, I forgot. Toast! Watch out.
All right, settle down, Morty. Settle down.
Settle up, Morty. Jane.
My ring? What are you... Oh, my goodness, where is my ring? Where's my ring? I don't know. I just took it off to do the dishes. Oh, my God, it's gone.
Technology has always been coming in and making important changes ever since the time of Shakespeare. And I think it's very interesting to see the areas in which we can use the technology that we know about, which is digital technology and information, to allow other theatre makers to understand what is possible.
I wanted to talk very much about the fact that there's this experience which was 360 degrees and therefore could be shot in 360 degrees and therefore ironically ended up as a VR experience with Acme that is now touring. But we managed to retain that sense of the theatrical, and I think that is an incredibly important point, this idea of context. Context changes content, especially when you're building information into it. Here's my little list of things that make up reality. Basically, I think we're just a bit obsessed with the visual. And here's the other problem that we have. every minute, really, you're getting millions and millions of pieces of information. And you can only really process about 40, which is probably making this talk quite good fun. The other million, because a million minus 40 is a million, you have to get rid of using cognitive filters. You have to get rid of them using biases and prejudice and filters and distorted thinking. And the internet is packed full of this stuff, so I'm not even really going to go there. Just to reinforce this sense that reality is not a full and practical thing. It is very fallible. And we really don't know what's going on up here. It's just a miracle that we're all able to walk around. So what that means for my work is that it's very easy to create magic by hiding things, hiding technology in physical objects. This is a project called The Cube. It's a film which is wrapped around a cube, and then you control it using a cube. And we called it The Cube. And this is James using the cube, and it's just lovely because it's a phone in a box, but he really thinks it's like magic. It's just using the gyro. It's really pretty simple stuff, but I love the look on his face.
On your face, dude.
But what about real facts? What about observable things like gravity and sensible stuff like that? Turns out they're a little bit iffy as well. Like, the idea that we are in 2017 is very nice, apart from the fact that it's the person who came up with that. And it's a very good question to ask your children. It's like, who came up with the year 0? And there wasn't actually one, and we went from -1 to +1. But who came up with that point? Because that would be a great place to visit in history. And the answer is a monk in Greece in 525 BC, AD. But we don't know why he chose it to be 525 AD. So we don't really know what year we're in. On better news, Einstein's gravitational waves has just been proved, so now we can prove that we exist in a sea of gravity, which leads to these wonderful things like the idea that, this is from Neil Turok, it's such a cute quote because I think he literally means that we'll literally be able to see it. And if you think all of that seems extreme, just remember that like at some point our amoebic ancestors developed a light, a photosensitive receptor cell that did something to light, and it was so valuable that it retained it, and then it swallowed us and became eyes in millions of different forms. We do not know everything. We really don't. And we're not even beginning to scratch the surface of what we know. But we are the first generation that understand what is possible, what can be achieved with all of this information. We're the first people who can step outside of information and see it as a spectrum that we can play with the world around us. And the things that actually I'm much more interested in the visual, and I'm actually very interested in a location, an orientation, how and where the computers in our pocket know we are, so that we are able, in time, to gesture and speak to the information that's around us. Because before sort of phones and before books, before cave paintings, that's how we communicated. So we will go back to that. It's like a wheel. So I'm going to end with this project, which is really just using dumb technology. Actually, it's old technology. It's like stuff that would work on all your phones. Sorry. And it's gyros and Node.js. It's old tech, and it's basically about turning it, rather than a phone, into a kind of magic torchy pointer thing, and allowing that to allow you to interact in creating small networks. And at the moment, it's doing little things like this, but it doesn't have a starting point. It's just starting at 0, 0, just like this. 0, 0, 0, 0. That's its starting point, and from there you get 360 degrees. So you can paint. You've got the whole world. In fact, it's not degrees, it's not 360 degrees, it's steradians. It's something mind-boggling. The point is that we have the whole of reality, and we don't need to be painting with light. It doesn't need to be screens. It doesn't need to be projectors. It can be fireworks or paint. I've got this fantasy about small mechanical mice doing the Nutcracker Suite. We're just getting started. This feels so clumsy to me because we're still using phones and we're still pointing them at screens and we're still doing these sorts of things. But it's not really about possibility. If you asked a photographer in 1917 what photography would be like in 2017, it would be as dumb as asking yourself what VR and AI are going to do for you in the next 100 years. So don't worry about it. This photo, probably the most famous photo from 1917, was taken by two 8-year-old girls, and it took 80 years to prove that it was a fake. Until they built computers. Which, if you look at it, is really weird, right? So, at the end of the day, my work is about that notion. Dreaming big, stepping away from reality. It's about finding the edges. And I think that that's something that we can all do. We can all take a step back and look at what it is that we're creating, why we're creating it, and just take some time to consider that. Maybe between us, we can deal with this multidimensional, non-linear, information-saturated world and put it all in our hands. Thank you very much.